So welcome everybody to Stump the Monk. I'm Reverend Dagon Gaither, and with us today is my friend and author and writer and Zen priest and amazing cook named Dana Velden. And she wrote a book a few years ago called Finding Yourself Inside the Kitchen, which is amazing. And mostly it's amazing because it's not just recipes. It's really about how to change the way we think about food. And that's kind of what I wanted to have Dana and I talk about today, is all of the things around food and the influences of food and the ways in which that can help us get in touch with something a little deeper, a little more meaningful in our life, which is what I think your book is about.
That's what I was going for, so I'm glad.
I think there's now a different conversation around food, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that, and in Zen, we've always sort of had a little bit of a food cultish kind of thing, right? But I think that conversation that we have in the Zen world is starting to sort of come out when you think about shows like Fat, Salt,
Fat, Acid, Heat.
Right. Which I think is an amazing show that does similar things to what your book did. Mm-hmm. And so tell me what you see coming out sort of around food in your world right now.
In my world, well, right now, maybe, I don't know if we would get into this now, but there's a lot about food culture, what food means as an expression of who you are culturally, and who owns that, and that type of thing. So I'm seeing a lot of that right now, and I'm really, really happy to see that conversation happening. But yeah.
Well, and I think that, yeah, I think we have to think about it's not just enough to think about like, oh, you know, I go to this restaurant and, you know, it's not just like, oh, it's really good food, but it's also sort of the ethics of food.
Right. You know, and at Zen Center, one of the lines that always stays in my head we do a meal chant is, you should know how it comes, or we should know how it comes to us, right. Or you should know how it comes to you. So understanding how your food got there, both physically, like, you know, who got it to the grocery store? Who owns the grocery store? What is the dynamic of that? How did it get there? Then who grew it? And then even deeper than that, what part of the world did it originate in? How did it get here? How is that part of the story of how it's here? You know, if it's a local farm, who are those people? You know, can you go visit it? Is it, you know, so there's a way that you can have that more extended relationship with what's on your plate. And also make decisions then based on that. I mean, maybe you're a really busy person, you know, maybe you're trying to raise a family and hold on a job and that type of thing. And maybe that's not the story you're looking for right now. But for many people, they're finding when they do, you know, kind of go beyond the utilitarian aspects of food and start to see it as a reflection of so many parts of who we are, both individually and a culture, it just becomes, to me, it becomes more interesting. And it becomes, that relationship becomes deeper, more nuanced. And so it goes beyond the utility of just, I've got to get, you know, fuel in my belly because, right. You know, I'm doing the next thing.
And I think that in that way, we start to then think about and food can help wake us up, right? Because like I really try to focus on, in my teaching and stuff, this practice of embodiment, right? Which goes beyond just kind of a utilitarian sit down and focus on your breath kind of thing, but really like, how do we take our place in the world? Mm-hmm. And from that place, respond to what's happening to us, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the ways we can do that is through the food that we eat, right? And if you're, I mean, I think it's really funny because, you know, I think about like people who are really busy, but they still can take time to like, you know, pay attention when they're chopping up something and really noticing how they feel about chopping up a carrot, let's say.
Well, you know, I mean, one of the things I always say is that I mean, this might be not 100%. I mean, I'm sure people can get away with eating 100% carry out
Right.
or 100% restaurants, although in this particular moment, that's not quite, you know, the scenario. I'm sure there are probably people who do that, but most people in the world are spending time in the kitchen.
Right.
You know, even if it's 10 minutes, just putting something quickly together or, you know, above and beyond that. So you're already there. The setup is taken care of for you. So how can you use that time to practice? I just think of it as practice, which
Right.
is paying attention to what's right in front of you in a very kind of simple, for me, gentle, kind but focused way.
Right.
You know, so and cooking food ingredients require that because, you know, if you're cooking from scratch, you're using agricultural products, things that are grown. They're not uniform, right? So this carrot is sweeter, you know, this week, and another carrot isn't as sweet next week. So you have to kind of taste it, pay attention, adjust. The sizes, you know, ripeness is different. Availability is different. You go to make a favorite dish and you can't get fresh basil. So what do? You know, I mean, you know, so you're there. If you don't pay attention when you're cooking, you're likely gonna make a mistake. You're gonna hurt yourself. You know, accidentally pick up that hot pan. You're gonna accidentally maybe burn something, or you're gonna forget an ingredient, or or whatever.
Right.
So again, you're naturally in this situation that asks for attention. And then I would layer on top of that as part of practice is attention, yes, but then appreciation.
Right.
So it's like, okay, I'm paying attention to this, but what is the lens that I'm using? And if you're using the lens, if you can put on the lens of appreciation, um, it's an opportunity for a very deep but simple, joyful moment. Because I think attention and appreciation together are, and in something as simple as cooking. For me, cooking also is a deep pleasure, and the food created is even a deeper pleasure. And then when it's possible to share it, you know, that pleasure just keeps growing. But that combination of being able to appreciate something when you have to do it anyways,
Right.
right? You know, so why not just try that practice and see what happens? And
Well, and you point to something really interesting, which is that cooking is not just utilitarian, even if it's just utilitarian in our minds, because it
mhm,
is so sensual, right? Like it invokes and involves all of our like we're smelling it, we're tasting it, you know, we want to make sure things are seasoned well. So, you know, there's this whole way in which, and we're feeling it. Like I think about as a baker, right? Like there's a
yeah,
way in which when I'm baking, you know, it's about how the ingredients come together and you know, how does the dough feel? Or, you know, if I'm
mhm,
making pie crust, it's, you know, it changes according to the humidity in the air and, you know, all, and the amount of water in the butter that day. So
right,
it is,
exactly.
it's, so you're looking at things and seeing things, and even before you taste them,
Mhm,
right? And then the other interesting thing for me is that when we're eating, so even if we go to a restaurant, right? Like I think about half of our half of the experience is, you know, how the food smells and
mhm,
looks, right?
mhm.
So one of
Oh,
my,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, nowadays, so we're recording this when restaurants aren't quite open. I mean, I think they're trying to, and it's been this, who wants to, and we're getting a lot of things to go.
right,
And one of the things I'm doing is trying to the extent that I can, my favorite local restaurants, if they have a to-go program, in order to support them during this time, I'll go and I'll get something to go. And I'll bring it home, and it can be just as delicious as I remember. But there's something about not having it on the plate, not being in the buzz of the restaurant with the music and the fire and and all of that, where it's all those extra elements are there. So yes, yeah. So tasting and being out, and so when I do bring things to go home, I really do at least try to plate them myself, right? Get it out of the cardboard box,
right.
grab a nice fork, a nice napkin, and just kind of give myself a few of those other things coming in. But one thing, you were mentioning before, all the senses. One of the senses I think is most interesting with cooking that a lot of people, I know you do, but a lot of people forget about, is smell. And I learned that from my mother from a very young age. She always would be, before she would check the cookies or the cake or the roast or whatever, she could tell by smell that it was time to take a look at it. And it didn't really matter so much what the recipe said.
Right.
So that's the other thing with recipes are wonderful. I love cookbooks. I mean, I absolutely appreciate a good recipe, a well-written recipe and all that. But they're really, on the long run, there's suggestions, because as like what you were saying, there's, your ingredients are different every time. Maybe you're using a different brand of butter. Maybe your oven is off by 25 degrees. Maybe it's more humid that day. So another thing cooking brings to us is that flexibility, kind of knowing that if we use our senses, if we pay attention to smell and touch and hear, like
Right.
sometimes when I'm frying onions, I'm not standing over the stove. I may walk away for a minute or two or do something, and I can hear by how that frying sound changes, that,
Right.
oh, I better get back to that pan. They could be starting to stick, or just
Time
the
to
way.
deglaze, or yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and what a delight to be
Right.
able to engage all of your senses in that way. I mean, it's pretty marvelous.
I actually explain to people sometimes about how, for me, I often will use a recipe the first time, sort of
Yeah.
follow it and see how it comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my mind, I start to play with the flavors or the ingredients, or, like it just starts to change and morph. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so then it becomes completely different in
Yeah.
some, in some kind of weird
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting to me, because it also means that I'm not limited to this idea of something,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think sometimes we get stuck in, and I do this myself. Like sometimes I forget, like, oh wait, no, I can actually sit down at the table and eat this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if it's, leftovers, take it out of the, I heat it
Mm-hmm.
up, I take it out of the container, I put it on a plate, and I sit down at the table. Even I live alone, and
Me too.
so,
Yeah.
um, sometimes it's like I forget, like, oh wait, no, I can still treat myself in the same kinds of ways that I would my neighbor who, sometimes comes over and we share food a lot, and,
Yeah.
those kinds of things, right?
Right. Well, it's really easy. I mean, there's been cookbooks and articles and all sorts of regular books written about how, well, first off, apparently more people are living alone these days than ever before, historically. And so the whole, yeah, it's a challenge for me
Mm-hmm.
to remember that I don't have to just go flop on the couch and put on Netflix while I'm eating my spaghetti. I mean,
Right.
I can do that, and sometimes I absolutely do, but mostly to put yourself down at the table. I like to light candles. That kind of adds a little extra something to it for me, and just to really sit and enjoy the meal. I mean, obviously food is a convivial thing. It's and as a species, we've eaten in groups for our existence, but eating alone is possible, and it can be enjoyable. And the obvious thing is you actually taste the food, and you have that whole enjoyable experience. But I find I have to, living alone, you have to kind of
make yourself do it. Yeah,
because it is easy to
we
end up on the
are really
couch.
busy, right? And so it's like, oh wait, I can actually chill for a minute and use
pause.
this time to like zone out or whatever, and to remember, like, wait, no, I don't have. And right now, you were right, like the way the shelter in place is working, I feel really disconnected, because one of the things that I did as a social thing as an introvert, and because I really prefer time, in either small groups but also one-on-one. So I spent a lot of time eating out with friends, or eating with friends. Like, we'd go to each other's house, or, there was this way in which that was how I stayed connected to my world.
Mm-hmm.
And now that that's not there,
mm-hmm.
I really feel the lack of that. Mm-hmm. And even, I have Zoom meetings and do the stuff on Zoom, and, but I still notice this lack of connection because I'm not spending time with my friends, eating together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a way in which I find I'm finding myself really aware of that slowing down actually automatically leads to tenderness, which I didn't really understand. Because, I think of myself as, struggling against that slowing down stuff, and like my resistance to so much of my life. And then to realize, well, no, actually, I'm not as resistant as I think I am, And in fact, I am way more tender than I ever imagined, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which then allows me to kind of, I've been reading Rod Owen's book, Love and Rage, and one of the things about that is that when you start to be more tender, you start to realize, like, oh, so much of my anger and rage and frustration comes from feeling hurt and brokenhearted, right? And there's so much about being brokenhearted now, and we can let that either shut us down or open us up.
Yeah. And I think I'm seeing so far, and it's staying that way so far, it's people are opening up to it.
Right.
I mean, so far, knock wood, and we just have to keep it going.
Right.
As much as we can. We have to support that staying open.
Right. Yeah. And that recognition that, we're okay, really. Yeah. Like, ultimately, right? Like, there's a way, like, and that's the great thing. Like, somebody was asking me how I was doing the other day, and I had to think for a minute because I couldn't really respond. Because I had sort of lost track of how I was doing or something. And I just thought, well, that's a really interesting thing, to just lose track of, how I was doing. And so, when I was making dinner that night, I just thought, oh, wow, like, let me come back to this experience and really stay in touch with how am I doing, right? And and then I decided I was gonna make a cake.
Great response. How am I doing? Well, I'm gonna make a cake.
Well, because there's something in the process of cake baking, especially because I don't always follow a recipe. Like, I just think about proportions. And so.
That's pretty radical.
Yeah.
Most bakers feel like they have to follow, like it's that old saying that cooking is improvisational and baking is.
Right.
And I never believed that because so much beautiful baking happened before recipes were written down. So
right?
if you understand
Proportions
proportions, yeah.
and for me it was about like thinking about what I had, right? Like I had some chocolate chips and I had some lemons that were getting ready to go bad. And so, and I had some frozen fruit, but I didn't really want to use it because I was, had other reasons for it. And so it was sort of like, okay, well, let's just put this stuff together and see how it turned out. And it was actually really good. And it was mostly things that needed to get used because they were, which is how I often cook. It's like I look in the fridge and go, okay,
Uh-oh.
I gotta use these things up because they're gonna go bad. And
Yeah.
but I think it's also really interesting because I do notice like friends of mine who I never thought of as bakers or cookers or you know food people who are baking cookies or I have one friend who's taking photos of her meals lately and she's been intentionally kind of making these really beautiful plates of food for herself, and it's our mutual friend and I
Yes.
think and I just find it fascinating. I mean, I knew she loved food and that was part of the reason that uh, she's one of the people that I had dinner with on a regular basis that I really miss. But what's interesting about it is I never thought of her as a chef or like
Right.
somebody who really did a lot of cooking. And yet watching her sort of make her, stuff and, she made a big thing of pie crust and started making galettes. And I just thought, oh my God, that's so interesting because some of them were savory and some of them were not.
Right.
You know,
Galettes are the best too. That's such a wise move, like make a quadruple batch of galette dough, divide it up. And like you said, you can go savory or sweet. And I think for people who don't know what a galette is, it's just simply pie dough rolled out into a circle, filled, and then very kind of casually, rustically, you just lift the border. You leave a border of dough and you just lift it over and fold it over.
right.
And so it's very, you don't have to worry about fitting it into a pie tin and fluting it or anything like that, and throw it in the oven, and it just is usually enormously delicious. And it also kind of has that wow factor too of, that there's something beautiful about it. And also you can fill it with fruit and it's sweet, or you can fill it with spinach and onions and cheese, or
right.
any sorts of any kind of savory filling, and it just mushrooms. Yeah.
Or the people, my friends who are making sourdough and starting sourdough and figuring out like how to do that, right? And I'm a horrible bread person.
Why do you think that happened? What is it about sourdough? I mean, to this day, you can't go to some grocery stores without only being limited to a 5-pound bag of flour because of the mass grab that happened. What caught the imagination there, do you think?
I think partially it was, for a minute everybody was hoarding bread, right? So I think part of it was utilitarian. But even after that, I noticed like friends who picked it up and started thinking about it. And I think it's partially that, it's something that is really fully on you, right? Like you start with this thing that you create called a starter, right? And then you feed it and nurture it, and then pull some off to use as leavening for bread. Or I had another friend who just made English muffins for the first time. And
my niece did this morning.
So there's something I think really about and I think bread is so primal, right? Like the first, from the time history's been written, we talked about bread, right? And so I think there's something about that process, that's just primal to us,
right?
And it's certainly why I can't do keto, right?
I tried.
I did too. And then also like the whole sort of like politics of, you know, dieting and all of that, which
Oh
I
yeah,
would have
that's
another
a whole other
conversation,
podcast.
right?
Yeah.
But there is this way in which I think, you know, I love bread and all of its forms, you know, and I think about, you know, people I know who would never identify as Buddhist or whatever, who own and use the Tozahara bread book, right? Our
Right.
first big sort of public facing thing from San Francisco Zen Center. And the fact that, you know, it's on almost everybody's shelf,
Right. Right.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's an entire book of bread recipes,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and I think that that's just amazing to me. But
Mhm.
it does point at sort of the primal nature of food, right? Like it touches something, even if it's just utilitarian.
Mhm.
It
Right.
touches something that's sort of unnameable,
Mhm.
right? That's intrinsic, but also, um, you know, I think about when I'm sick, right?
Mm. Mhm.
And I I have certain cravings that I want that feel nourishing and nurturing to me, and some of them are really ridiculous. Like you know, macaroni and cheese out of the box and fish sticks, which are so
Childhood food. Mhm.
it's completely processed, but there's something in that that
Childhood. Yeah.
right that touches my
Mhm.
childhood, that touch, and it's unknowable, but it's so nurturing to me as a
Mhm.
person.
Yeah.
Right? And I
Mhm.
eat it with ketchup, and you know, it's just sort of like it's just so amazingly sort of in some ways it's like, how could that be nourishing, right? Like it's completely processed and
Yeah. But that points to how nourishment happens on so many levels. I mean, yes, I understand the scientists and the nutritionists have come along and they've got their numbers and their percentages. And I'm not saying that's not all true, but just instinctively I look at that and I think, oh, but it's more than just that. It's more than how percentage of iron and fiber and
right,
and that type of thing. And we've got to be really careful to reduce food just to numbers,
right,
you know. And so if you're there, I think that there's something that happens when you feel the comfort and ease of those foods that, again, to me, they ring of childhood foods, a time when you were nourished and comforted, you
right,
know, by, you know, maybe your mother, maybe someone in your family or whatever. And that has that also is in there, and you can't measure that by,
right,
you know, percentages. And I think we also have to kind of trust that as, you know, we're in that vulnerable state of being sick, and what do we reach for, and that there's wisdom in our bodies that knows that, okay, this isn't a, you know, whole wheat fiber blah blah, but it's gonna do something that's gonna help me. And it
right,
does, I find, you know, for me. And you're not living on that day in and day out. It's,
right,
you know, it's for that particular moment.
right.
And yeah.
And I think you know the same is true with our spiritual practice, right? Like we
Mm,
can't reduce it to numbers, and it's part of
right.
the problem I have with this, the secularization of it, and the ways in, you know, the mindfulness based stress reduction, or
Yeah.
the ways in which it becomes philosophy or psychology, and leaves the realm of the unknowable or
Mhm.
it's not unknowable, it's just uh, like you can't put words on it, right? Like
Well,
it's
it's not, it doesn't come from the intellect, right? It
mhm,
doesn't come from your thinking,
right,
you know. And that's where, you know, ceremony is so important, because it's the body enacting it.
right,
Yeah.
right. And that's what I, you know, like when I talk about embodiment, when I talk about being in my body, the, you know, the idea is not just, you know, oh, I'm bowing, and oh, I'm,
Mhm.
you know, chanting these chants. It's also like the moment in time and my intention of the moment. And, you know, there's all this places that it hits, and that are, yeah, immutable and
Mhm.
not intellectual and not psychological even.
Mhm.
It's just
Mhm.
you know, like there's a way, I remember the smell of the tatami mats in the Buddha hall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, over time they sort of absorbed the incense and stuff. And then one year we got brand new tatami mats, and it was lovely, and it was really, you know, like you smelled the tatami again. But
the new grass smell of the new ones, yeah.
But at the same time, it lost something in the comfort of it, right? Like it lost something that had to do with, you know, all of the sweaty bodies that have been bowing on it, and the
all those feet,
right? And all of the incense and all of the, you know, spills and wax stains, and, you know, I think that that's so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that's the same, like we were talking earlier about food, like the food becomes this thing where it is like it's unnameable.
Right.
It's just, it's beyond, if we let it, right? Like that's the other piece. Like we have to allow it and let it.
Right. We have to notice that that's happening, even if we can't quantify what it is.
Right.
Through that process. Yeah, definitely.
So, and on that note, I think it's a really great place for us to, you know, sort of end. And I feel like
this was so much fun.
Yeah.
I could do this all afternoon.
It's true. And then I realized, like, you know, there's also something about, like, how long can people pay attention?
I know.
You know, and but also, like, how long. Yes, I could do this all afternoon, and then I think about poor Fred, who has to sit down and edit it and make it into something that.
Sorry, Fred.